March 25th, 1918. Minsk, Belarus. It's 6 in the morning, and members of the Belarusian Republic's Council, or Rada, are exhausted. It's been a long night, full of debates. The previous evening, the Belarusian Socialist Assembly, one of the largest political parties in the Republic, introduced a proposition calling for full independence as a brand new nation. Belarus, while under German occupation, is still technically tied to Russia and not officially independent. But a majority vote in favor of independence has finally been gained. Prime Minister Josep Voronka takes his pen and signs the proposal. And with that, a new nation is born. It's 1917. Across Europe, the fighting of the First World War rages. From the trenches of the Western Front to the snowy Alps, to here, in the vast plains and forests of Belarus. Belarus has been a part of the Russian Empire for over a century at this point, ever since Poland-Lithuania was partitioned in 1795. For years, the Poles had repressed Belarusian customs and the Belarusian language, and the Russians had continued to do this. Still, Belarusian nationalists had gained ground throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and slowly began to build a national identity for themselves. Now, in 1917, the Belarusian city of Minsk is a hub for refugees and armies. The Great Retreat of 1915 had pushed the war's front line, which had been around 200 miles from the city in May, to around 50 miles away by September. Already under the strain of martial law, factories in the city shuttered, and residents fled east. Roads between major towns and cities in Belarus became choked with refugees, and overcrowding was rampant. Belarus had mostly remained in Russian hands throughout the war, with only some areas in the west falling to the Germans. This was a good thing, too. Belarus was important. The Belarusian city of Mogilev housed the supreme headquarters of the Russian Imperial Army, and Minsk had become the headquarters of the Russian Western Front Command. But despite Belarus's importance, political activism in the region was limited. As 1917 began, though, things started to change. The mostly bloodless February Revolution in Petrograd forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate and give up power in favor of a new democratic government. Belarusian nationalists began to organize, calling for autonomy, and new political parties appeared in Belarus, with two major ones forming. Firstly, there was the Belarusian Socialist Assembly, or BSH, which focused on workers' rights and was heavily left-leaning. In contrast to them was the Belarusian People's Party of Socialists, or BNPS. More moderate than the BSH, the BNPS focused on Belarusian autonomy. Despite their differences, both parties were opposed by Polish and Russian movements, which saw the Belarusians as a threat. And even without this opposition, many Belarusians were reluctant to get involved with the nationalists. But progress was still made. On March 25th, the first Congress of Belarusian national organizations was held in Minsk. Delegates aimed to properly assemble a national movement for Belarus while gaining more cultural and regional autonomy, and they were optimistic. The Congress, however, was plagued with disunity. Delegates had ridiculed the Belarusian language and movement even before the Congress began. At first, things seemed to go well. The Congress elected a presidium, or council, to organize their work. But as the Congress's first session was closing, one delegate, Ivan Metlin, stated that it was the wrong time to start a nationalist movement, and that any Belarusian movement is not natural, because, as he said, it lacks a firm foundation among the masses. Understandably, this outraged many delegates, and one, an older peasant, kissed the Belarusian flag in protests of Metlin's words. Metlin was promptly thrown out of the Congress. In the end, the Congress created the Belarusian National Committee, or BNK, led by BSH member and established politician Roman Skirmunt. Skirmunt and the BNK faced heavy opposition from the start. Belarusian peasants were convinced that aristocrats controlled the BNK, and they would lash out against its members any time they tried to speak in favor of Belarusian nationalism. The BNK would end up being short-lived anyway. It had failed to create national organizations, and it failed to address land redistribution, two of its major goals. As such, in July 1917, the Congress of Belarusian Party and Public Organizations convened to decide how to deal with the BNK. The Congress would vote the committee out of existence, dismissing Skirmunt and replacing it with the Central Rada of Belarusian Organizations and Parties, which would host delegates from locations across Belarus, alongside representatives of various Belarusian organizations. Some of the BNK's power was also handed over to the Congress's Executive Committee. This committee was, to say the least, a source of trouble. Conflict between the BSH and BNPS would arise during the Executive Committee's elections. It started with an argument over election methods, and though the BSH would back down, things were reaching a boiling point. The next day, a few BSH members proposed to re-elect the Congress's Executive Committee, calling the results unfair. The BNPS defended the results, and several delegates stormed out, leaving the BSH to hold a second election and driving a major rift in the nationalist movement. Overall, the BSH was becoming somewhat of a problem. It dominated the Central Rada, something which became clear during its first session. One delegate criticized a lack of attention to the Belarusian nation during speeches from members, while another, a BSH member, snapped that socialism had to come before Belarus. This focus on socialism rather than state-building weakened the Belarusian movement and prevented nationalists from paying attention to the people. As such, things in the Belarusian countryside remained almost the same as before. While some towns made progress, most of Belarus still held on to local identities instead of embracing Belarus as a nation, an idea which, in Belarusian, is called tutejsask, or local patriotism. Teachers and Orthodox clergy often outright refused to support Belarus, and clergymen even called nationalists a bunch of hooligans. Western Belarus, by contrast, the part under German occupation, had their own Belarusian schools, though Polish nationalism and Catholic clergy still stood opposed to Belarus, and the Germans simply failed to take the Belarusian national movement seriously. In eastern Belarus, however, things were beginning to change. In August, the Central Rada of Belarusian Organizations and Parties approved the creation of Belarusian army groups, an idea which was popular among Belarusians fighting on the Romanian front. And in October, a Congress for Belarusian soldiers on the Western Front agreed to establish the Central Belarusian Military Rada, or CBVR, which would be in charge of organizing these groups. The CBVR was chaired by Simon Rak-Mihajlovsky, who was supported by his deputy Kostas Jezavital. Though the process was slow, many Belarusian soldiers were enthusiastic about the idea and made promising candidates to form Belarusian units. Still, events in the heart of Russia would drive the most change in Belarus. In November, the Bolshevik Revolution had broken out, replacing the Russian provisional government with a new communist one. The Bolsheviks took control of many areas, including Minsk, and Belarusian army unit creation ground to a halt. Many socialists protested these actions, and the Bolsheviks would eventually promise to leave Minsk so long as the other leftist parties didn't call troops off the Western Front to suppress the revolution in Petrograd, something which was agreed to. Though this conflict in Minsk had calmed, Belarusians were beginning to turn against the Bolsheviks, seeing them as corrupt and acting only in their own self-interests. As such, political activity in Belarus began to move much faster. By this time, it had already been decided to dissolve the ineffective Central Rada of Belarusian organizations and replace it with a new body. With the BSH in almost complete control of it, the Rada had alienated moderate Belarusians, and the organization was packed with members who had no interest in Belarus. As a result, the Central Rada became the Great Belarusian Rada, or VBR. The VBR began work immediately, promising land redistribution to peasants, assuring families near the front lines of the war that they would not lose their land to the government, and sending representatives to Petrograd to gain the favor of the Russian government, including one Josep Varanka. In contrast to the BVR, however, stood the Belarusian Oblast Committee, or BOK, which formed in Petrograd in November. The BOK was almost entirely loyal to Soviet power and received much financial support from them. Its members were shocked by the BBR's foundation, as they had hoped to overcome the Belarusian nationalists and form a Soviet republic in Belarus. The Soviet government, too, stood opposed to the VBR, fearing the growth of a secessionist movement, and it would attempt to stall any cooperation between the VBR and BOK, fostering tensions in Minsk. In early November, pro-Bolshevik military units arrived in Minsk. Despite attempts to stop them from entering the city and prevent a panic, the Bolsheviks pushed through, quickly occupying the city and taking over the regional government following the resignation of Provincial Commissar Ivan Metlin, the same man who had challenged Belarusian nationalists at the Congress of Belarusian National Organizations. Following this, they would declare martial law and curfew on November 30th, all while attempting to legitimize their control by holding congresses rigged to show an illusion of Soviet support and control in Belarus, and gaining the support of disillusioned soldiers. Still, coordination between the BOK and VBR was inevitable. Despite BOK fears that an anti-Soviet bourgeois republic would be proclaimed in Belarus. Soon, this cooperation paid off. On December 5th, 1918, a crowd of guests, sympathizers, and delegates from across Belarus met in the Minsk City Theater, waiting eagerly for the opening of the first All-Belarusian Congress. At 7:30 p.m., Simon Rok-Mihajlovsky, chairman of the CBVR, announced that only 300 delegates out of an expected 900 had arrived. Most of the missing had been delayed by a lack of coordination between the VBR and BOK, as the two organizations had squabbles over the date of the Congress, and had told different delegates to arrive in Minsk on different dates. As a result, the official Congress date was pushed to December 7th, much to the crowd's disappointment. While waiting, those already in Minsk decided to elect a temporary congressional council, with 23 members from nearly every acronym in Belarus: the BSH, BOK, BNPS, CBVR, VBR, and Belarusian People's Rada, or BNH, which was based in Petrograd, alongside representatives of smaller unions, committees, and Soviets from across Belarus. Soon enough, the time had arrived. On the evening of December 7th, Rok-Mihajlovsky gave a speech, officially opening the Congress. A military orchestra played, and a traditionally dressed choir sang revolutionary songs. This was followed by greeting speeches from representatives of the various organizations present. But, beneath the happy atmosphere of the Congress, trouble brewed. One delegate, a Latvian Social Democrat, expressed his disdain for national divisions, demanding that the Belarusian national flag, hanging over the theater, be thrown out. The delegate was promptly removed from the Congress, to the sound of insults and ridicule from those present, and things continued to move forward. On December 9th, a permanent congressional presidium was elected, chaired by Rok-Mihajlovsky, but still, tensions remained high, as accusations emerged calling BOK members agitators standing in the way of the Congress, something which prompted the CBVR to threaten BOK members with arrest. To avoid more political splits, the Congressional Presidium was restructured, and BSH member Ivan Rada was elected as the new chairman. Concern remained, however, over the planned German-Soviet peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk. Neither the Germans nor the Soviets were likely to take Belarusian demands into account or give Belarusians a presence at the negotiations, as German support for Belarus had no return benefit to themselves, and the Soviets didn't want to support nationalism beyond anything helping them. As such, some delegates suggested immediately proclaiming the Belarusian Republic as independent and entering the peace negotiations themselves. Most delegates, however, opposed the idea, instead choosing to try to reach out to the Bolsheviks and build close ties with Russia. Belarusian nationalism, however, still seeped into the Congress. Some BOK members and Belarusian Bolsheviks even began to criticize Bolshevik autocracy openly. Though not all socialists approve of Belarusian nationalism, and many thought that the Congress shouldn't preside over state building. These concerns were ignored by those who urged the Congress not to delay, arguing slowing down would be counterproductive and convincing the Congress to continue discussions. Darkness, however, loomed over the Congress. On December 18th, delegates met in the early morning. The previous day's meeting had ended early when one of the delegates had presented false identification, prompting an inspection of all of them, and it had finally resumed. The Congress adopted a new resolution, establishing the All-Belarusian Council as the temporary highest order in Belarus, and authorizing the preparation of a Belarusian Constituent Assembly to decide the country's fate and form army units immediately. It was also decided that Belarusian representatives should be sent to the Brest peace negotiations to promote Belarusian interests. While not a declaration of independence, the resolution did ensure that the people of Belarus would decide their own fate. This resolution, however, would be the last of the Congress. Around 2 a.m., the Congress was voting on approving the creation of the Belarusian Constituent Assembly when two Bolsheviks, alongside a commander and armed soldiers, interrupted the Congress, declaring that the building was surrounded by the military and denying Chairman Rada's requests to present identification. They declared that the Congress was over, and the soldiers arrested the Congress's presidium and removed them from the building, despite the delegates' protests. Even pro-Bolshevik Congress members called the Bolsheviks' actions illegal, and the Congress would attempt to form a second presidium, which was also quickly arrested. The Congress was powerless, without guards to protect itself, and the remaining delegates would follow the arrested, singing revolutionary songs and a funeral march. Outside, they found machine-gun-armed cavalry units ready to escort them home, and by 5 a.m. the Congress was dissolved. Several delegates called for a second All-Belarusian Congress to be held as soon as possible, and they would decide to dissolve all other Belarusian organizations except the CBVR in order to streamline the Belarusian government. But things in Minsk were only getting worse. In the early hours of December 20th, CBVR offices were raided and Rada members were detained. The Bolsheviks began calling for a fight against the bourgeois Constituent Assembly, slandering Belarusian leaders and supporters in speeches and the press. In January, a crackdown began as Soviet authorities dissolved the Minsk City Duma, accusing it of being counter-revolutionary following its condemnations of the dissolution of the Congress. Later that month, the CBVR would be dissolved by the Soviets, and several of its members would be arrested, though work underground was continued by its members, many of whom had escaped arrest. Outside of Minsk, meanwhile, the Poles proved problematic to Belarus, showing hostility towards the CBVR and clashing with the Belarusians in the city of Bobruisk, which was occupied by the Poles on January 20th. From there, the Polish forces pushed west, gaining control over a major road to Minsk and further threatening the fragile Belarusian movement. Despite all of this hostility, the All-Belarusian Congress continued work underground, forming an executive committee to take over executive power, which was chaired by Giuseppe Voronka. Its location was kept secret for fear of being discovered by the Bolsheviks, a fear which was justified. Committee Chairman Voronka was arrested twice in January 1918 alone. Still, most Belarusians considered the executive committee both legitimate and a better representation of the Belarusian people than the Soviet authorities, and the committee continuously called for the people to speak out against the Bolsheviks. Despite the dire situation in the east, on the German side of the front, things were going well. A Belarusian conference had been organized in Vilnius in January, which established the Great Belarusian Rada of Vilnius, or Vilnius VBR, led by Anton Lukiewicz. The Vilnius VBR would represent Belarusians in the occupied areas, especially emphasizing the connections between Belarus and Lithuania and pushing for the unity of the old Grand Duchy. They also demanded a democratic republic and contact with the eastern regions, requests which they planned to bring up at the coming German-Soviet peace talks. After a ceasefire between German and Soviet troops in December 1917, treaty negotiations had begun in Brest-Litovsk in February. Both sides needed peace, the Soviets to prevent another revolution against them, and the Germans to take troops off of the Eastern Front for use in the West. Belarusian representation was not wanted by the Soviets, and the Bolsheviks attempted to detain Belarusian representatives. Despite this, the Council of the All-Belarusian Congress did manage to send an unofficial delegation, including important figures such as Simon Rach-Mihajlovsky and Ivan Rada, to the peace talks. Although the delegation successfully made it in, they were only allowed to observe and were restricted from expressing their demands. It didn't matter too much anyway, as the Soviets would reject the proposed treaty, calling it too harsh and prompting Germany to resume the conflict on February 18th. The Germans rapidly advanced east, occupying almost all of Belarus, while Polish troops coming from Bobruisk closed in on Minsk. Neither army would face much resistance due to a premature Bolshevik demobilization, and the Soviets fled Minsk for Smolensk in a chaotic retreat on the 19th. By the evening, Polish and Belarusian units appeared on the streets of Minsk, disarming remaining Bolsheviks and arming their own men. The Belarusians took control of an arsenal, followed by the governor's house and the Hotel Europa, which served as the regional headquarters of both the Bolshevik secret police, or Cheka, and the paramilitary Red Guards. There, they would fly the red-white flag of Belarus for the first time outside a government building. As the Bolsheviks retreated, arrested activists, including CBVR members, were released from prison, and a CBVR executive committee meeting would be called not long after, appointing CBVR member Kostas Jezovitau as commander of the Belarusian military forces in Minsk, and officially transferring power in Minsk to the Council of the First All-Belarusian Congress. Despite this, the Belarusians faced the problem of Polish units in Minsk, who had begun to disarm Belarusian units and seized the Belarusian-held arsenal. Although this nearly boiled over into armed conflict, the Poles and Belarusians came to an agreement, dividing Minsk into two zones. Still, tensions remained high, and the Poles, who had more strength than the Belarusians, began to erode this agreement, taking more and more of the city while anticipating reinforcements from the Poles to the south, who had still not arrived. In spite of Polish advances, the Council of the All-Belarusian Congress would pass the first constituent charter on February 21st, calling Belarusians to unite and support the Congressional Council as the true Belarusian government, and stating that a temporary executive council would be formed to lead Belarus, known as the People's Secretariat. The Secretariat would be made up of 14 members, including Ivan Rada and Josep Voronka, who would become its chairman. The fighting between the Poles and Belarusians, however, would halt as German troops entered Minsk. The Germans disarmed Belarusian military units, confiscated the funds of the People's Secretariat, around 300,000 rubles, and forced the Secretariat and Executive Committee of the All-Belarusian Congressional Council to give up most of their political power. They also removed Belarusian flags from buildings and restricted officials from leaving Minsk, all major blows to Belarusian authority in the city. Still, any remaining threat from the Bolsheviks was seemingly neutralized, as, demoralized by the swift enemy advance, they agreed to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on German terms on March 3rd. Germany occupied much of Belarus, despite most of the country not being within the agreed treaty border, but there was discontent among locals. Belarusians still saw the peace treaty as a violation of their wishes for no territorial divisions of Belarus to be made, and dangerous economically, as recovering from the war was something that would be left to local populations rather than being handled by the central German government. But there was still separation from Russia for Belarus to benefit from, being seen as the only way to ensure national interests were secure. And so, on March 9th, the Second Constituent Charter was passed, officially declaring the Belarusian Democratic Republic, or BNR, and granting universal suffrage and freedom to Belarus's people. The People's Secretariat, led by Josep Voronka, would head the new republic, and the Council of the All-Belarusian Congress transformed into the Rada of the BNR, becoming the new legislative branch of the republic, and taking in members of the Vilnius VBR. It was led by Ivan Rada, with Josep Voronka as his deputy, and on March 24th, Rada would open the first session of the Rada, welcoming the Vilnius delegates. The Rada quickly turned to discussing total independence, a discussion spearheaded by the BSH, but the Rada was divided over the issue and heated debates began, with the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks particularly opposing the idea. Still, the BSH's proposal prevailed, and at 6 a.m. on March 25, 1918, a majority in the Rada approved the proposition. The Third Constituent Charter renounced ties to Russia and declared all ethnically Belarusian territories as part of a new and independent Belarusian Republic. Not all was perfect, of course. Although the BNR claimed much territory, it did not have the force needed to enforce this claim, and the interests of the BNR were considered dangerous to its neighbors in Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Still, things were going well in Belarus, as Orthodox priests returned to their parishes in the west, and Belarusian language schools appeared in the east, though the German administration remained opposed to Belarusian army units. The Ukrainian People's Republic, despite some disputes with the BNR, also formally recognized the new nation, and limited trade between the two nations would begin soon after, though Ukraine was not able to give Belarus much support. The BNR government also began to take more independent actions, hoping to gain the support of its people as well as international recognition, and it began placing focus on funding newspapers and books to gain support. However, divides in the Republic were beginning to open already. Some protested cooperation with Germany, something which was already reluctant due to Germany's unwillingness to support the BNR's government, while others protested strong ties with Lithuania. Within the BSH as well, rifts had opened. Following the sending of a telegram to the German Kaiser by the People's Secretariat, thanking him for the liberation of Belarus from Russian occupation, the BSH would be polarized, splitting into three distinct groups. The anti-German socialist left wing of the BSH became the Belarusian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries, or BPSR. The pro-independence, reformist, democratic centrists became the Belarusian Social Democratic Party, or BSDP. And, finally, the smallest of the groups, focusing on balancing social and national issues and promoting independence within the Democratic Russian Federation, became the Belarusian Party of Social Federalists, or BPSF, which was led by Josep Voronka and Ivan Rada. Within the larger Belarusian government, too, there was conflict over this seemingly small issue of the telegram, and the Republic was on the verge of a political crisis as a result. To calm the nation, Josep Voronka proposed restructuring the People's Secretariat to be more efficient, and he resigned on May 14th to allow for a second secretariat to be formed under a coalition government. Roman Skirmunt, who had previously been a BNR Rada member, would become the new chairman, though he was quite unpopular, being reluctant to address land concerns, and conflict would erupt between Voronka and Skirmunt over what, to Voronka, appeared to be less of a coalition government and more of a centrist one. The BPSR and BPSF would also come into conflict with Skirmunt's government, seeing it as against the interests of Belarus's people. Despite this, Skirmunt would continue to focus on international recognition and cooperation with the Germans until his government was replaced on July 22nd by a third People's Secretariat. Led by Ivan Rada, it was more agreeable to Belarusian socialists, but still focused on relations with Germany and Ukraine, which, despite its recognition of the BNR, was contesting some border regions in the south. It was important to gain German support as well, as the Lithuanians had extended their border claims into areas claimed by the BNR with German approval. On November 1st, a Belarusian delegation sent by the Republic's Rada sent the Lithuanians a proclamation, which emphasized that they would not be taking any Belarusian territory. It was not well received. By this time, the Fourth People's Secretariat, which had been renamed the Council of Ministers, had been formed under the leadership of Anton Lukiewicz, the former leader of the Vilnius VBR. His government hoped to remain independent from Lithuania, and, though an agreement was made between the two nations for a new state, the details of the agreement were left intentionally vague to prevent Belarus from losing its newly gained independence. But Belarus was fighting a losing battle to keep its independence. On November 11th, 1918, the guns of the First World War stopped firing. An armistice in the West was signed by the Germans, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was declared invalid by the Soviets on November 13th, with the Germans unable to truly resist. German troops would flee Minsk on December 3rd, and, though the BNR's government tried its best to negotiate with the Soviets, they were forced to flee their capital of Minsk for Vilnius and then Grodno, where German armies remained until 1919. The BNR had lost power in its homeland, and had failed to gain the support it needed to survive, both at home and abroad, and the Republic's government was left scrambling. Anton Lukevich tried to consolidate the Belarusian movement and keep on good terms with the Allies, while at the same time refusing to approach the Germans, Lithuanians, or Poles. He wanted to gain full independence for Belarus, and hoped that whoever ultimately held Belarusian land would be open to returning it to the BNR. Despite this appeal to the Allies, alongside the successful creation of a delegation to the Paris Peace Conference, the Republic would not return. The Allies were exhausted and not willing to recognize the Belarusian state, and the BNR would be forced to turn towards Poland, which was advancing against the newly proclaimed Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarusia, or SSRB, in their war against the Soviets. The Poles were moving fast, taking Pinsk and Baranovichi in March, then Vilnius and Grodno in April. The BNR's government, which had been in Grodno previously, would relocate to the Lithuanian city of Kaunas until 1923, and the Poles continued to advance, taking Minsk in August. There they would create a special Belarusian army unit under the command of General Stanislaw Bulak-Balachowicz to gather local support. The BNR would continue to watch from afar, by then under the leadership of Václav Lostowski and a Fifth Council of Ministers. But their legitimacy would be contested by Bulak-Balachowicz, who had entered the town of Mozyr on the 10th. He proclaimed the BNR as independent once more, and declared himself president and head of the Belarusian state, dismissing the Rada in Kaunas and electing a new Rada to form a provisional government. The new Rada's first meeting on November 12th made clear that they were unwilling to support close ties with their Polish colonizers, something stemming from the Poles' harsh treatment of Belarus and the territories they occupied. This strained any hope of Polish support for a renewed Belarusian state. Balachowicz would also form a new national army, which began fighting the Soviets, but he would gather little popular support. The Belarusian people were tired of war, and seeing aristocrats being placed in the government, as well as pogroms or violent massacres of Jews, would reject Balachowicz, leading him to abandon Mozyr and retreat towards the Polish border just 8 days after his arrival. Despite this, some Belarusians still attempted to cling to the hope of a democratic Belarusian republic. The town of Slutsk, to the south of Minsk, decided to declare itself a part of the BNR once again, and began forming militia units to defend the town from the coming Soviet advance. They would engage the Soviets just days later, with local militias fighting alongside activists and army veterans. Fighting was harsh, but ultimately these fighters were overwhelmed and forced back to the Polish border, ending the last major resistance from the BNR to Soviet control over Belarus within Belarusian territory. The BNR's Rada was once more the true Belarusian government, but they still faced several problems aside from the obvious lack of territory within Belarus and the contesting of legitimacy by Belarus's new communist government. Political splits rocked the Rada throughout 1919 and 1920, as the BNR split for a time between the BNR Rada of Anton Lukevich and the People's Rada of Václav and international recognition remained limited, with the Germans restricted from recognizing any nation without Entente approval, and the Poles ultimately refusing to support Belarusian statehood, instead moving towards total integration of Western Belarus following the close of their war against the Soviets in 1921. The BNR's government had tried to gain a seat in the negotiations to end the war, hoping to push their demands, but ultimately they were excluded and their requests ignored. The BNR's Rada would condemn the final version of the Treaty of Riga, which ended the war, for splitting up Belarusian territories and paralyzing Belarus's struggle for independence, calling it a mockery of democracy and a grave offense against the Belarusian nation. Following the treaty's finalization, the BNR would cease its attempts to gain the favor of Poland and the Soviets, instead turning back to stronger ties with Lithuania, including the renewed possibility of unification, alongside international recognition. Though there had been progress made by the BNR, Estonian and Finnish recognition came in late 1919 and official Lithuanian recognition in 1920, the union with Lithuania would never come to pass, despite the two nations' shared distaste for Polish occupation of their own claimed territories. The BNR also faced the question of the legitimacy of the Belarusian SSR's government. Although the BNR's government emphasized that the BSSR was not free to decide its fate under the Soviet system, the BNR did give limited recognition to the Soviet government in Belarus. Despite this, the BNR refused to give up power altogether, and remained distant from the Belarusian communists while continuing to operate in exile during the coming decades. With that, our story here comes to a close. For now, this tale doesn't have a happy ending for the BNR, and it doesn't look like it will for at least a little while longer. But there is always hope. This has been 8OD Potato, and I will see you all next time. Hello, everyone. Apologies for the long wait for this video, but I'd like to take the time really quick to give thanks to everyone watching this and to the support for this project. Between research, script writing, and editing, drawing, and recording, this video has taken us several months to produce in my spare time. I'm extremely proud to say that this is the first YouTube video that I know of to go this in-depth on this subject, and I hope that everyone watching enjoyed this. If you'd like to see more of these types of videos, or you'd like to submit ideas for future videos on any topic, just leave a comment below, and if you're feeling up to it, maybe a like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to show your support. Thank you all so much, and see you all soon.